Hi everyone. The aim of this video is to help you understand how to go about answering a 16 marker on social learning theory. My plan is to go through a rough kind of overview plan of how you should structure your answer and then show you an example of an answer and what that might look like fully written out. The example essay that I've got for you has been pulled from the best bits of different student answers that I've seen when marking this question. So before we can go any further, we need to break down the question. To be able to do that, we need to consider what command words and spec terms are used in the question itself. So looking at the question itself, we've got the command word describe and we've got the command word evaluate, and our spec wording is social learning theory. So that helps us to plan out the structure of our answer and also make sure we can select the appropriate content. Generally, in a traditional 16 marker like this, where there's no scenario attached, the breakdown is 1/3 description, 2/3 evaluation. It's always better to overestimate the amount of evaluation required in psychology answers. So the exact marks for this question are 6 marks describing the approach and then 10 marks evaluating the approach. I generally always recommend a 5 to 6 paragraph structure where you've got 2 paragraphs describing the key concepts to get 6 marks, and then 3 to 4 paragraphs evaluating the theory depending on how much time you've got left. It's always better to go with quality over quantity, so I'd much rather see 3 well-developed, elaborated paragraphs than 4 or more briefer paragraphs where the points are just more listed rather than explained. So starting with the AO1 descriptive part of the essay, these are the key terms and concepts that I would be looking for in the answer as a marker. Particularly, I've used the colours to demonstrate the difference between the 2 key parts and aspects to the approach, which is you've got in green the kind of social observational processes, and then in yellow the mediational processes. And I'd really be looking in the top band answer for explicit reference to the student showing awareness that these are cognitive and internal processes. As with any approaches essay, I would always start with providing the overarching assumptions, which in this case are those 2 aspects of the approach. Touching on that point, generally I would not recommend any kind of introduction or conclusion for that matter in essays in psychology. They tend to be either too vague or repeating what's already in an answer. It's just with approaches specifically, they all have a set of underlying assumptions that go with that kind of act as an introduction, but generally introductions are not needed. And as you can see, there's a lot of specialist terms, there's a lot of concepts to go through. And so for this reason, this is why I'd advise against using the Banduras-Bobo-Dole study as part of your description. It can be. Studies aren't necessarily descriptive or evaluative in nature. It depends on how you present them. But by looking at this, you can see you've clearly got more than enough to illustrate and talk about without referring to the study. I would save that for your evaluation, and I'll show you how to do that later in the video. Before I show you what this looks like fully written out, I just wanted to point that I have included the term self-efficacy, which is not an essential term. You could easily get 4 marks without including this. I've just put it there as an extra. It's something that you might have touched on or will touch on in second year when you do gender or aggression. Essentially, it's kind of around the idea of confidence. If you see people like you doing a behavior, you're going to feel more confident in your own ability to replicate that behavior, and so therefore it kind of ties in with motor reproduction. So you can see here in paragraph 1 how some of these terms are used effectively in sentences and how an answer can demonstrate understanding. So to start off with, we've got the overarching ideas about observation and cognitive factors. They've name dropped Bandura as a key term. They've then got role models and explained what that is with an example, which is a very good way of demonstrating your understanding. They've then explained what imitation is and introduced the idea of mediational processes generally, and made it clear that they know that they are cognitive internal processes. Paragraph 2 then elaborates and is very much focused on explaining the mediational processes, but what this answer has done really well is effectively tied in some of the social processes like identification and how they link in conjunction with the mediational processes. So we've got attention and then an explanation, which they haven't used the same word. It's something called a tautological response, where you use the same word to explain a thing. So an answer wouldn't get credit if they said attention is where you pay attention. You're using the same word to explain. You need to use a synonym to show you know what that word means and that you comprehend the understanding. And that's what this answer does very well here. So again, retention, and used a synonym to explain what that word means. Motivation, same again. And then this is where they've tied in the social processes and how they link to those cognitions. So how identification, which is explained with an example, and vicarious reinforcement, which is explained, tie into increasing motivation. And then finally they've got the fourth, mediational process, and explained. And then the idea that only if you go through all those cognitive processes successfully, for lack of a better word, then the behavior will be imitated. So these two paragraphs together total just over 200 words, which is about right for a 16 marker. You really don't want to be writing any more, which is why it's better to leave the Bobo doll study for evaluation, so that you can make sure your answer is in the proportions of the description and evaluation, and your answer is in the same ratio as it is in terms of the marks. And as you know by now, time is tight when writing answers to these questions. You've only really got 20 minutes or so to write both the description and the evaluation. In a paper, you're likely to find 2 or 3 of these in the same paper, so you really want to be focused on moving on, not over focusing on the description too much. Obviously this looks different because it's typed, but if you're handwriting, then really you're going to want to aim for about 2/3 of a side for your description. Any more than that, you're not going to be really gaining lots of extra marks. And then maybe a side and a bit for evaluation is the goal. And you can see as well, every single sentence in this answer has a term. It's very, very focused on the relevant content. There's no room for flowery language or waffle. Unfortunately, it's very concise and precise is the aim of these answers. Okay, looking at evaluation then. So there's lots of different aspects that you can comment on with the social learning theory approach. These were the 4 main points that I saw that were done particularly well. in answers that I read, but you could also talk about things like how the fact that it accounts for some aspects of determinism and a bit of free will as well in terms of the role models we observe is a strength compared to some of the other approaches. Like I said before though, although there's 4 on here and plus there's other possible points as well, I would much rather see 2 or 3 of these done really well, ideally 3. The other thing that I wanted to highlight at this point before I show you some example paragraphs is that a lot of these points kind of refer to the Bobo-Dole study. And one of the main things to be careful of when using this study is that there's a lot that you could say about it, but you want to be very selective in how you use that study. You want to use parts of that study to demonstrate the evaluative comments that you're making. So for that reason, I would start with using that study as supporting evidence as your first evaluation paragraph. So supporting evidence. And then here, I really like this paragraph because not only have they said, they've named the study, but they said exactly what concept from the approach that the study supports. So the study supports identification. And then they've elaborated on that. They've added detail with the follow-up. And again, they've identified specifically what part of the approach that it supports, not just states that it does support. You might also notice that there's no real details about the procedure, and that's something that I would generally recommend and avoid when you're using a study for evaluation, is that if you are going to mention the procedure, it's very light touch, maybe a sentence maximum, if at all. Often when you're explaining the findings, you end up describing what they did anyway, so it's really not necessary. It's only when a study is part of the AO1 that you generally talk about the procedure in detail. So for example, in the social influence topic, the Milgram study in variations is the descriptive content. You can then see in the next paragraph how, although the paragraph is focused on the approach, which is what you want to be doing, you don't want to be going off on a tangent about evaluating the study itself, because this approach is more than just one study. So the point in this paragraph is about how it's mostly scientific, and then the explanation as to why it partly is and isn't scientific, and then using the Bandura study aspects of it to demonstrate that point. So again, you're using the study to illustrate your point. You're not focusing your answer on evaluating the study. You're using the study to evaluate the approach. Although it would have been nice where they talked about it being very controlled, maybe a brief example of, one aspect that was controlled in the study. And then finally, this is another point I saw quite commonly about the fact that it ignores biological factors. Although I did see quite a few answers referring to it being a reductionist approach, which isn't quite true. It's kind of not really reductionist or holistic. It's kind of in the middle. It counts for, cognition and social processes. So, it's less reductionist than others. But it's definitely not holistic either, because it does, miss out biology, which is a key factor. And then again, this student or this answer, has used the Bobo-Dole study to demonstrate and illustrate this point without focusing their answer on the study itself. So they're using this specific finding, so the fact that, in his research, the boys overall had a higher average aggression level than girls, regardless of what model they were watching, what consequences the model was receiving, which, social learning theory on its own wouldn't be able to explain. whereas something like the increased level of testosterone, which would be a biopsychology explanation, potentially would be able to explain. And then there's a kind of link about talking about questioning the validity and over focus on nurture. But it would have been nice to see something here, maybe about like an interactionist explanation being better, some explanation that accounts for, cognition, social processes, and biology as well, may be the most valid and true explanation of behavior. So then looking at mark band and the mark leveling for a question like this, there's 5 main areas really that are described in these comments. One is knowledge, so how detailed is it? Accuracy, is everything they've said true? Have they, has an answer got things incorrect or muddled? Is the evaluation thorough and effective? So what that means is that there's a breadth of points and also there's depth in them as well, that they're well explained. Focus refers to how well organized this answer is in terms of both selection of content, that everything they've said is relevant, and also the way that it's laid out as well. So having a clear structure, that it's clear where the description and evaluation is taking place. And then finally, specialist terminology as well. So the use of key terms and precision in the use of those key terms, that rather than just saying copying, the answer uses imitate throughout, that kind of thing. So based on this, the essay, if we put together the 5 paragraphs together, it would definitely be a level 4 essay. It is well detailed, it's accurate, everything that is said about the concepts is true. They've got some examples to illustrate. They've got a range of points that are elaborated, and there's no real key terms that weren't used that should have been or could have been. Okay, I just wanted to quickly show you an alternative paragraph that I saw people talk about quite well as well, that you could include as well or instead of one of the other evaluative paragraphs that we went through. So talking about how we can use the knowledge of these processes to reduce undesirable behaviours like aggression and gender stereotypes. Thank you for watching. I hope this video was helpful in helping you understand your own responses. Thanks for listening.